Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. If understanding the new planning analytics engine in IBM Planning Analytics was not your intended stop, feel free to sit back and relax, and I'm sure you'll learn something from this. All right, so for today's presenters, I'm John Persisto. I'm the Client Success Manager here with Revelwood. I've got with me Lee Lazaro, who is our Planning Analytics and IBM Practice Lead, and Ivan Sapero, who is a Planning Analytics Senior Consultant. So for today's webinar, we'll just go over a couple of things here. We're going to talk a little bit about Revelwood, just a couple of minutes on that, and then we'll jump right into the meat of the webinar, understanding the new Planning Analytics engine and what it is, what the differences are, the setup and usage, and then we'll go through a demo and actually show you the live use of it. All right, quick about Revelwood. Many of you on here already know us, but for those of you who don't, we've been working with TM1 and IBM Planning Analytics for nearly 30 years now. As an award-winning IBM Planning Analytics partner, we've helped hundreds of companies, both large and small, realize the most value from their planning analytics investment. And we sit on both IBM's Partner Council and their Planning Analytics Advisory Board, which keeps us up on all the developments in the planning analytics ecosystem. You'll see a tagline here: we speak business first, and we really do. We talk to our clients about the technical, and we're technical experts there, but we bring a wealth of finance experience and business experience to the table. Lee, I'm going to pass that over to you to jump into your section.
Sounds great. Thanks, John. All right. So in a previous webinar, I had talked about a trend where finance teams are shifting their focus towards the financial aspects of planning analytics instead of focusing solely on the technology aspects. This allows them to focus more on data analysis, less on the technical maintenance. Unfortunately, this sometimes works against the reality of changes to a company's IT approach for various reasons. Team size, what they're focused on, what tools that they want to learn. Put this all together, companies are finding it harder and harder to maintain their planning analytics or PA environment. Okay. So to mitigate this, we're seeing more and more customers migrate to the cloud. At this stage, I think most people know what the cloud is, but for those who don't really fully grasp it, you can think of it this way. The cloud is just a simple way of saying, let someone else own and maintain my machine for me. Let me use the application. So instead of going into cloud details during this presentation, I'm simply going to say, if you're thinking about migrating to the cloud, if you have any questions about the path to take or the things to consider, then please don't hesitate to give us a call. The reason that I talked about the cloud is this is where we transition into version 12. So, yes, version 12 is available as a local instance. It's accessible on premise using something called Cloud Pak for Data, but most of our customers associate version 12 with the cloud. Okay? So what is version 12? IBM references version 12 as the next generation of IBM Planning Analytics. And there's a lot of different ways that it's referenced, similar in nature to what's going on through the tool in the industry right now. A lot of different ways people call it, a lot of different things people call it. Some people call it version 12. I've heard references to PA engine. IBM oftentimes references it as the engine. People still call it TM1. They call it TM1 version 12. Okay? But a lot of different names to what we call it, but what is it? The main change is that it's a back-end change. It's a restructure of the tool itself. It's designed so that it's going to be real easy to scale it up and down, make it a little bit more stable. And the way that it does it is using something called containers. So in the past, and anybody who has worked with us or done some kind of an upgrade knows that as we were starting to use the PAW tool, we referenced the concept of containers. So in the past, only PAW used containers. Now, everything uses containers, the entire tool, okay? From the back end, there's a bit of a restructuring. From the front end, it's still the same user experience. So for those who have already migrated up to the PA environment, still the same two tools. If you're on the web aspect of it, you're going to be using the PAW component. If you're on the Excel side, you're going to be using Pathé or PAX, depending on what terminology you use. But it's the same two sets of PA tools associated with what your users are going to see. Okay. Now, the goal of this presentation is to talk about what's different in version 12. We have a lot of other webinars associated with PAW, the interface, the usage of it. So I'm not going to focus on the PA aspect. I'm going to focus on version 12 by reviewing it in a couple of ways. What's new, what's different, and what has been removed. Okay? So I'm going to start by talking about what's new. The first item that we're going to talk about of being new is how you create the database, the creation of the database itself. Okay. The way that you create new databases in version 12 is by using an online wizard. Okay? There is no longer a need to create Windows folder structures, have config files, create services, all the different things that we used to do to create a new database. The approach in the version 12 world, the approach in the new world, is to use a wizard-based approach that's simply found on the administration screen. On the administration screen within the databases section, there's a button, giant blue button you can see on the screen right here that says create. That's how easy it is to create a database. And it allows you to quickly create a brand new database. When you click on the create button, you're going to get a pop-up window, and that pop-up window is what you can see over to the right side. And I like to think of this pop-up window as broken down into three parts. Part number one, what's the straightforward aspects? Straightforward aspects, the name and the memory. Okay, so you could see over to the right that when you click on create, the first thing it's going to ask you to do is it's going to ask you to create the name of the database. In this particular example, we created a database called webinar. And then the next two things it's going to ask you to do is to associate the resources. I'm going to keep calling it the old world and in the new world. In the old world, we used to work directly with IT to say, let's make sure that there's enough RAM. Let's figure out our hard drive space. If this is virtual, let's figure out how much we're going to allocate to the machine. These two aspects are now part of the wizard. Select the disk space, select the memory. What the wizard is going to do is not only is it going to let you just simply pop in how much space do I want to use, but it's going to give you a little bit more information. It's going to tell you how much did you have available, how much of it is currently used, and it's going to give you the ability to define your own systems based on how much space is available. Once we've created those two basics, the next aspect is to start thinking about the backup process. So in the legacy world, what we used to do is we used to back up all of the Windows-based components. We had Windows folders, there were .cub files, .dims, all these other aspects. And we used to use functions where we would write TI scripts that do save data all, and maybe we would create extra applications using batch scripting, PowerShell, Python, whatever tool you were able to, whatever tool you were comfortable with. In the new world, it's simply a trigger. You flip on and off. In order to turn on backups, all we have to do is click on that option that says on. By default, but the default is going to give you the ability to off or on. And if we turn it on, you then just simply define what time do I want it to automatically happen. When you set up these backups, this backup is the equivalent of all of the different stuff that we're going to be using for backing up, restoring, migrating, etc. And you could see on the screenshot that we have of what's going to happen is once a backup is turned on, it is then going to be accessible in the administration screen through a new section called backup. This backup is going to give you the opportunity to then run them manually, use it for a restore, use it for downloading, aspects like that. Okay. Now, one of the things to note, however, is the approach used with the backup is a little bit different. In the legacy world, in the old world, our typical restoring process is stop the database, restore the files, restart the database. In the new world, in version 12, the database must be running. If your database is stopped, you'll be able to see the screen that we have down on the bottom. You'll be able to see the automated backups on your administration screen, but you won't be able to upload, create, or restore a backup while the server is stopped. Okay? So this approach is great. And while this approach has its strengths, an important takeaway is that it's different. Okay? It's that simple. It's different. It's not good. It's not bad. It's different. Why am I pointing this out? It's because this is where you want to start thinking about how you approach the tool. You want to ensure that you're not just looking at version 12 as a tech tool, and that you're not just thinking about code changes and interfaces and all of the technical and development aspects. This is one example of a process change that you're going to want to take into consideration when you think about your model administration. Okay? Concept of backups. Another aspect that comes into play with setting up the database is the ability to create replicas. And the goal of a replica is to be able to scale up and down during busy times. I mentioned on the first slide that the ultimate goal of the system is to give it scalability. Okay? And the way that it does it is it does it through an approach called high availability. What high availability mode is it's in simplistic terms, it's a way to have the engine, way to have version 12 manage multiple replicas of the database in parallel. And what it does is it's the equivalent of saying, I'm just going to copy. I'm going to copy the existing database and I'm going to have multiple iterations of it. Okay. And what will happen is as I create the multiple replicas, any data changes are going to go to all the replicas, but the requests are going to get spread. Okay. What does that mean? Any data changes are going to go to all replicas. Johnny the planner is on your input template and he has a number 10 on the screen. He decides to change it to 20. He keys in the number 20. If I have multiple replicas of the database running, that reference to the new number 20, including all the rules, consolidations, all the data points, are now replicated through all of the instances of your database. Now Johnny decides, okay, great, I finished everything. I want to run a turbo integrator script. That's what we call a request. And those individual requests then get sent to one of the replicas. And the reason that that happens is this is the equivalent of load spreading, or some people may know this as load balancing. This is going to allow you to do load balancing throughout the entire environment. Once the script is done, then the data goes to all the replicas. And this approach gives you the ability to have multiple databases running at the same time at situations where I have, maybe during a forecast process, I have a small subset of users, but during the budget, I have a massive subset. Or maybe I do a monthly forecast and I know that 2 days a month I'm going to have every user in the system in, but for the other 28 days, it's going to be not as intensive. This gives us the ability to create replicas where we're able to change that with no downtime. You're able to, while the system is running, you're able to scale up or down based on your peak periods and your slower periods. And what's going to happen behind the scenes is the engine. The engine of version 12 is going to manage each replica to make sure that everything's good. It's going to make sure that each of the instances are running. If needed, it's going to restart a replica. It's going to make sure that everything is stable and running. And this gives you the flexibility of making sure that you don't have to now massively build your system to run at all times for your highest situation of when it's going to be running. You're able to scale it as you go. Another change in version 12. Another change, as we were saying, is that concept of the different infrastructure. So as we said before, the system is designed to use containers through the entire environment. And it does this by using OpenShift, which is a Linux-based approach. Okay? As a result, there's no longer a concept of Windows. And this is probably the biggest change for those of you who are familiar with TM1 and Planning Analytics behind the scenes. There's no longer a concept of Windows because this is where a lot of those things, a lot of the aspects are going to change. One of the changes, it's going to be associated with your turbo integrator, with your TI functions. There's no longer a Windows structure. So you don't have functions like execute command to run any external programs. Okay? Another change is the way logging is done. Since there's no Windows path structure, there's no longer a logs folder that we want to or have the ability to access outside of the tool. Okay. Third change is the ability to manage files that you want to upload, create, reference. These are things like your export files, your ASCII source files. Okay. Version 12 realizes that there's still a need to store and access these files. So it's accounted for by a new built-in tool called File Manager. And File Manager is accessed inside your modeling workbench by simply right-clicking on the database. You'll see an option to go into File Manager. It makes it very easy to upload, move, delete files and folders. Okay. We're going to dig further into all these items later in the webinar. So for now, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Okay. Now, what's changed? Because of the approach, version 12 only supports the OData compliant REST API database. It supports a new REST API. Many of the previously supported versions of the API are no longer able to interact with the database. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that some of the legacy tools are no longer supported with the new engine because those legacy tools use the old API calls. Okay? When you look at all the different interfaces and you think about all the different interfaces, this right here is a list of what's available, what's deprecated. And the easy way to think about this is the two new PA interfaces, Planning Analytics Workspace, Planning Analytics for Excel. Those two interfaces are still available and ready for use. All of the other interfaces that you may have been using are now deprecated because they don't properly read all the REST API aspects. Okay? So what does that mean? That this means that not only will there be a change in what tools you use, there's also going to be a change in how you use it. Okay. What do I mean by that? If you're already on a full Planning Analytics environment, then you no longer use Perspectives or TM1 Web. But if you're still on a legacy system, then the approach to your interfaces will be different. Okay. In the legacy world, the way that the system worked is the web interface, TM1, and I'm just referencing TM1 Web. The web interface was for your end users. It was used only for reporting and input. Everything else was done in the Excel environment through Perspectives, reporting, input, development, administration. Okay? In the new world, we flip it 180 degrees. Okay? In the new world, Excel is used for your reporting and input, and the web, PAW, is going to do it all. Okay? Planning Analytics Workspace, your PAW interface, is going to be your new developer and administration environment. Okay? And like I said, the goal of today's session is not to go into the details of that. We have a series of webinars that we've conducted about how to do development in PAW, how to do some of the administration. And I absolutely encourage you to take a look at those or contact us if we can answer any questions. But the main takeaway of the difference is flip that full 180. Planning Analytics for Excel is going to be the majority of your end user interface. PAW is going to be end user interface and your developer and your administrator interface. Okay. Another change, as we had talked about a few slides earlier, we no longer have access to a Windows file system. Okay. Instead, we now use the built-in file manager that gives us the equivalent of some kind of a content repository. Well, this means that Turbo Integrator commands that we previously used, the ones that referenced Windows folders, now reference the new file manager. Okay? This is going to be anything that references your ASCII commands, your file commands, and the various aspects in that. Okay? Now, one of the ones that I'm going to focus on a little bit is one that almost all of us use on the development side, ASCII output. Okay? This right here, what we could see on the screen is a example of what you see in File Manager. So on the left side of the screen, this is just a default File Manager structure that appears. And on the right side of the screen is the use of that command of ASCII output. So what I did is I wrote some real simple code and I just created 3 iterations of it. Okay. You could see that each iteration of the command defines a file name, just like the command worked previously, and then says, put something out. In this case, I did something real simple, just letter XXX, okay? In the first instance, the one on line 3, I just referenced a file name. And in the other 2 instances, lines 5 and line 7, I referenced a path, okay? So how would this work? The first output is going to place the file directly into the root of File Manager. It would end up as a sibling to the existing folders. Same concept as before. If I simply just do an ASCII output and say, give me the file name, it's just going to put it into a default folder. Default folder used to be data subfolder. In the new world, it's simply the root of File Manager. Okay. The second output, you could see in the second output that the way I reference the file name is I put the folder path / the file name. Okay, one of the things to notice is slash. This is where we also think through / versus \\. We want to make sure that we're using the appropriate nomenclature. But what that second one will do is that second one will put it directly into the folder for us. Okay. The third example, this is where things get interesting. Because in the third example, what you could see is you could see that I told the system to do an output file and I told it to put it into a folder called LL. Okay. Well, there is no folder called LL. Okay. So what is going to happen, and one of the new things about version 12 and using the concept of file manager is the function will not just create the file, but it'll create the folder for you. It'll create the path for you and then put the file into the new path. Okay. Now, as always, this is where you want to think about the implications of it. This is where you want to think about the pros and the cons. Okay. Pro, you no longer need to check to see if a path exists. This is going to save you some lines of code. I no longer have to say, does the LL folder exist? If it doesn't exist, oh my gosh, I'm going to get some kind of an error. It's going to create it for you. But that same exact pro is potentially a con, because now you have to make sure that you're accounting for it. You have to account for typos or accidental mistakes in your code, because the system will create whatever you tell it to do. This makes it really important for you to double check your code. Now, as good coders, I know that you guys are all doing that anyway. Everybody always double checks their code before they run. There's so many different memes out there about that. But the reality is, this makes it even more important for you to have a development environment and for you to check your code, because the system will now do exactly what you tell it to. Okay. Another difference is that there's a different approach to ODBC. So as we learned during the discussion about interfaces, the approaches for the API calls are different. In addition to the interface, this also impacts the way that ODBC works within the new engine. IBM has therefore introduced a new tool called the ODBC data connector. And what it does is it converts your source data into something that could be used by the new database, by the new API calls. Okay? The ODBC data connector, it's also referred to as ODBCIS. And really the goal of it isn't just to grab the data from your source system, it's to also convert it. It's to also transform it to something associated with the new REST API. And the way that you configure it it's pretty straightforward. It's, for those of you who are on the cloud, it uses the similar concept. So almost the exact same concept of what you're doing right now. Step number one, download it. The way that you download it is you grab it from the administration screen within databases. There is a drop-down that simply just says ODBC connector. And what it does is it will download a zip file that'll contain a series of batch files. Step number two, install and configure those batch files. You're going to install the components onto the area associated with your source data. You're going to configure the two systems to talk to each other. Pretty straightforward. Same exact concept as what you're doing right now for those of you who are on the cloud. Okay? But one thing to notice is, and one thing to remember, this is going to impact your TI scripts. It's going to impact the way that you reference these sources, because the database no longer makes calls to the local drivers because they're not available in the cloud. What it instead does is it instead queries the data connector, which references the source as a URL. It no longer references it as the original source. It references it as a different way. This is just another example of a change that you're going to want to think about when you migrate to V12. Still the same concept, still the same approach of let me go out somewhere, grab my data and pull it in, but the interaction, the way that you're going to use it is going to use a bit of a different approach. Okay. Now, in addition to making some changes and having some new features, there are some features that are no longer applicable, no longer needed. Okay, as we mentioned a few times, the API approach is different. We saw how it impacts the interfaces. We just talked about how it impacts ODBC. But don't forget, this also impacts any custom code that you may have developed. Many of the clients that we work with create their own custom code, and they're going to use different tools. Those aspects of the different tools are something that you may not be able to use anymore, or you may need to make some modifications to. Okay? And you're also not going to need the concept of bulk load. Bulk load was created to utilize times when the minimal activity was expected. This is created for situations when you didn't want users to bump into tasks like large data loads, system maintenance activities. Okay? But the use of parallel interaction means that this is no longer needed. It's therefore redundant. I'm not going to get into the details of bulk. I'm not going to get into the details of parallel interaction, but if you're not familiar with that aspect, there's some great help online and within the operations guide. Main takeaway, bulk load is now redundant. Okay. And other aspects that have been deprecated. Okay. As expected, there are various turbo integrator commands that have been deprecated. We don't necessarily need all the TI that used to be there. We just talked about bulk load concepts. This also applies to batch concepts. IBM's online help provides a full list of all the deprecated commands, but there's a few that stand out to me based on the way that the engine keeps track of the data changes. Okay. One cool thing about version 12 is that transaction logging is always on. We have a series of blogs, we have some videos, there's a lot of postings out there of how do I make sure that transaction logging is always turned on? When do I turn it on? When do I turn it off? How do I maintain it? It's always on in version 12. And because of this, we no longer have to tell the system when to enable, when to disable transaction logging. Okay? It also means that we no longer need to use the commands to write data to disk because it's all taken into consideration. The commands at the bottom of the screen, these are just a few of the ones that we use for this purpose, but they're no longer needed. They've been deprecated. Okay? And on that topic, another thing to note is that version 12 changes the overall approach to logging. So the way that it worked in previous versions, in the old world, logs would only be generated when an error occurred. So each process had its own error log file. It would get created when it's needed. And then that way I could go back and I can either use the interface to look at it, or I could go directly into a Windows folder structure. Okay? Version 12 takes a different approach. In version 12, a log is always generated. What does that mean? A log is always generated. Well, every script that you run, whether it's run as a process or a chore, is actually going to create a file. And that file is going to be used to store any errors. So instead of creating a file only when it's needed, it's always going to create a file. And that way it has some kind of a repository to put the information about errors. Now it gets a little bit confusing because the nomenclature that's used, the way that the file is named, it still looks like an error log. I know that that's something that IBM is looking into, and I know that eventually they may change it. But right now, one of the things to note is that every time you run a script, you're going to see a file. When we look into that file manager we discussed before, you're going to see a file that looks like it's an error log. But if you look closely, you're going to see that the size of those files, when there's no errors, is 0 bytes. And the file doesn't contain any data. Okay, so the phrasing that we sometimes use is called an empty error log. This concept of empty error log files is IBM's new approach to indicate a successful process execution. Okay. What's confusing? You're going to see the error log. What's something that you don't need to panic about? Don't worry about the fact that it's creating all these extraneous files because they're not going to impact your memory. Okay? These error files are going to get removed when you close your session, when you get logged out. You don't have to worry about permanently seeing those logs. You don't have to worry about filling up space with a series of small log files. But it is important to note that the approach is different. You will always see some kind of a log file, which currently looks like it's an error log. Okay? Now, because of this, we had talked about some turbo integrator processes, or I'm sorry, turbo integrator functions that are no longer needed, but we also have the exact opposite. There are turbo integrator functions that are going to be new. Okay. The run process command. The run process command allows you to run multiple TI processes in parallel. For those who have not used it before, it's designed to speed up processes by dividing the work into multiple parts. Okay, these are things like data loads and aspects like that. Version 11 used run process, and version 11 allowed this command to run, but there was no good way to coordinate the various pieces and look at the details. Version 12 introduces a series of new functions: cancel jobs, get job status, etc. And these new functions allow you to get information on the various pieces. Okay. In version 12, you were also able to run external programs and scripts via the execute command function, which I had mentioned before. But this function no longer applies since you don't have access to the file system. This function was replaced by the new one called execute HTTP request. And there's a set of supporting functions that provide details about the request. So now we have the opportunity to run the HTTP components and see information about it, see what's going on, be able to do a little bit of tracking. Okay. Now, there's also some other aspects in regards to the deprecation, and these are associated with the cubes. Okay. Client cubes. Most of the information here was associated with logins, passwords, web settings, things like that. But in version 12, user information is no longer based on the database. User information is now based on other aspects associated with the IBM cloud. These aspects no longer exist. The cubes have been deprecated. And the same concept of properties cube. The various properties cube have been deprecated from the system. Okay. But one of the biggest changes that you're going to notice is the removal of the stats by cubes. stats by chore, stats by cube, stats by server, etc. Okay. This means that anyone using any of these cubes for optimization will have to follow a different approach. Stats by rule is still available, but the other stats bys aren't. IBM is aware of the way customers have been using it. They're addressing this for the future, but for right now, it's important to know what's there and what's not. So now that we talked theoretically about many of these changes, I'm now going to shift the presentation over to Ivan so he can show you the tool in action.
And let me know when you can see my screen.
Excellent. All there?
Ah, beautiful. All right. I am Ivan Sapero, Senior Consultant for Revelwood, and I am the hands-on guy. So I am going to do two broad topics. Lee talked about all the new features and did a great job, but I'm going to show you where those features are. This first part will just be kind of a map of the administration panels and all of the features that Lee just said. And then we're going to really get our hands dirty, and I'm going to show you how to do a migration of a database object from one server to the next. There's an entire wizard. We will go through every step and every parameter in the wizard. So I hope you guys are ready because I'm going to have fun. I am in the home page. I will go to administration. And let's talk about the material differences and cover the stuff that Lee talked about. For the most part, this page is the same. There are some differences where if you look at the memory here in the center of my screen, you can see how much memory this webinar _source database has taken, and you can see how much has been provisioned to it. So this is a good screen to look at to judge the state of health of your server. Excuse me. At the bottom left, there are two buttons that we will talk about because this is a big deal. When you click on manage, this is going to be the same screen that Lee showed where you create the database. Now the database has been created. So what can you do to an already created database? You can check off the high availability, the load balancing that we talked about. You can set up the number of replicas. Going back to what we just talked about with memory and memory consumption, if you have enough RAM, we have 27 gigabytes available. I could change this to give it 15 gigabytes. I guess I couldn't because I don't have enough. So I'd have to put something like 8 gigabytes. So the great thing about version 12, and you'll see this in the migration, is that it helps you. It helps you manage your server. So that was a good feature. The other thing I want to point out, although I think it's pretty obvious, but I'm going to point it out because we will talk about it in a few minutes, is the automatic backups. This is where you can turn the backups on and off and set the time for the backup to occur. I am going to cancel out of this. We've covered everything here. And, upgrade. Unfortunately, I'm already on the latest version, so I can't quite show you how the upgrade works, but I'll definitely talk about it. You can check your version in the middle of the screen. I'm on 12.3.8, the latest version. So there's no upgrade. However, if I was on a previous version, I would click on upgrade, a pop-up would appear, and then you would select the new version and you click on upgrade. I've done an upgrade a couple of times. It takes about 10 minutes or so for it to upgrade. Now, one note on the upgrade, there will be a warning where the system will tell you, you can upgrade, but you cannot roll back. So that is just one inherent limitation that we have in this new world of the cloud. So I'm just looking over everything. I think I have covered everything material in details. So let's go on to the next tab. Next tab is activity. It used to be called threads in the legacy world. There's really no change here. This is where you would see your TI processes running. You would see if there's any lock contentions, how long it has taken, and you could kill individual TI processes. This is same as before. Same thing for the next tab, configuration. This is where you make the changes to your CFG parameters. Nothing has changed here. And like Lee talked about, backup. This is where I asked you to pay attention a few minutes ago. This is where you see your backups. And there are two types of backup. There's the manual backup. There's the automated backup. Automated was what we set up at 1 in the morning every day. You can create a manual backup relatively easily. You click on create. You give the backup a name, just note, no spaces, and you click create. The backup will be provisioned. It will run. It takes a few minutes. I have created 2 backups just so you can see how this works. Recovery. Let's suppose you have somebody did something that you didn't want them to do. You have to recover from a backup. You click on the 3 vertical dots, whether it be manual or automated, and you have a couple of options. Restore would be the backup. So I'm going to go through it up until the last step, just so you see how it works. You click on restore. It says restoring webinar source with my backup will permanently overwrite the contents. This cannot be undone. You would click on restore, and you click on restore. Everything would be restored. Cancel out of that, because that will take too much time for the webinar. And let's talk about the other options that you have. You can download the backup to your desktop, to your laptop. You can also delete the manual backup. Once it has been downloaded, you will click on this little arrow and you can upload your database backup. So if you have tape backup or whatever your disaster recovery methodology or mandate is, you can handle it with the downloads or with the manual creation of the backups. And let me take stock of where we are with the details, activity, configuration. I talked about all of that good stuff. Okay, now the next part, we're going to do the good stuff. I'm going to show you how to migrate a database object from one server to another server. But before we do that, I want to take a step back because a lot of things did change now in V12, and I'm going to do a little bit of a tangent and tell you a little bit of what's going on behind the scenes. Although it looks like all of these servers are on the same machine, they kind of are, but they're not. Lee referenced the term container. The full term is a Kubernetes container, which is a whole different technology I'm not even going to get into. But to use an imprecise analogy, you can think of every server operating in its own container, i.e. a bubble. This bubble is secure and it only has certain entryways to communicate to it. So what we're going to do the migration, we need to use a method that will securely communicate between the bubbles. We're going to use a platform called Git, G-I-T. That stands for Global Information Tracker. Git is a worldwide platform used by all programmers or most programmers to collaborate and manage their source files. It is a very powerful, feature-rich platform. But for migration, we are not going to use most of the features. We are only going to use the feature for secure communication and secure object transport. I will give you another imprecise analogy, but it'll help you understand if you're not aware of this technology. Think of 2 bubbles. They do not communicate with one another. We need them to communicate with one another. So we are going to use Git to create a secure platform, a secure tunnel that will connect the 2 bubbles. It will shunt the objects from one to the other, and then it will close that tunnel. So it is very secure. All right. I think I've babbled on enough. I'm going to go on and do the hands-on part. We have to be either in a report or in a workbench to access the Git features. So I have a workbench already running. It is very creatively named Webinar Migration, totally empty. And that's how it should be, because I just need to get to this area on the left. The goal for the next few minutes is to learn how to take an object from webinar source to an empty database called webinar destination. Step number 1, you would right click on webinar source on the source webinar or the 3 vertical dots. Everything that we will deal with is in the submenu under remote repository operations. There are 3 things that you can do here. The first option is to add objects to the repository. This is termed a push. We are pushing TM1 V12 database objects to Git. Then at the destination, we would update the model. We would import. That's called a pull. We will pull in the data. And then there is reset connection to repository. In order to be efficient and communicate securely and not always have to call out to other services, what V12 does is it stores some of the parameters. And when you're doing this migration over and over again, suppose you're moving stuff between UAT and dev and prod, sometimes you don't want it to remember. So that's where you would click on reset connection. It does not destroy anything. It just erases some of those parameters. And me being the paranoid guy that I am, I'm going to go ahead and click reset and show you how this works, because I've been practicing and I don't want I want a blank slate. So I'll click on reset. It says, are you sure you want to reset? I'm going to click on yes. Once I click on yes, please look up at the top right. You're going to have that little message that will say Git has uninitiated successfully, or something similar to that. Let me click yes. There we go. Git uninitialized successfully. And now let's start the push. I'm going to the three dots, click on remote repository, and I'm going to add objects to the repository. This new wizard shows up. That reset that we just did erased all of these previously populated parameters. Let's go through each one and I will explain what they are. The first one is your Git URL. So in order to use Git, you will have to open up an account in GitHub. GitHub is the web interface for Git. Notice how it says here, the URL of a Git repository. You can think of a repository as your folder, your main folder where everything will live in subfolders. In the Git world, there's repository, which is that main folder. Then there are subfolders, which are called branches. So you could push to the main folder, but that's really a bad practice. You want to push to the branches. So you open up the account in Git. We've all done this before. You open an account, choose a username, password. That's old school by now. I'm going to paste in, excuse me, my URL. My repository that I created was called webinar.git. I'm not that creative. Please allow me that. And now you're going to do the public key. You get the public key from your Git account. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it in here. And then there is the private key. You also get this from the Git account. I need to highlight my private key, copy it, paste it. The private key will be hidden by version 12, which is a good thing. So what the public key and private key do, they help version 12 create that secure tunnel we just spoke about that connects to webinar.git. So now we're going from that source bubble to Git. If I wanted an extra measure of security, I could put in a passphrase. I am not going to do that for purposes of this webinar, but it is also an option. I'm going to click on next. Now here's where the fun starts. Here's where we are going to choose all of the objects that we want to push to Git. So if I would select this box, I would select all 65 cubes. But for purposes of an example, I am not going to do that. I will select one cube. So I'm selecting on the row that says cubes. I have 65 cubes. I am going to select BPM Finance. Now, when I select it, notice on the right, and 7 dependent dimensions were selected, but that message was pretty fast. But what V12 did was the following. It understood that I wanted to migrate BPM Finance. It also looked for all the dependencies. So I know BPM Finance, I can tell it is built by these dimensions. These dimensions have been pre-selected for me. Now, there are secondary dependencies, like the dependency on the dependency, that are also selected, but not visible. You're probably saying, Ivan, that doesn't make sense. What's going on? Well, think of it this way. I know that the cube has those dimensions. We just covered that. Okay, we're good. But the dimension has all of those subsets. Those subsets are also going to come along you don't have to select them. The cube also has rules that's also been selected for you. You don't have to select them. The cube also has views. Those are all selected. So what version 12 is trying to do, it is trying to help you, and it is trying to make sure that you have a congruent and cohesive migration package so that when it arrives at the destination, it works as intended. Okay? And the same thing, off on a little tangent, happens with chores. If you select a chore with 10 processes, it will select the chore itself and those 10 processes. So all of that is handled directly by version 12. You can turn it off should you want with the little gear up here at the top right. I'm going to click on it. We'll just talk about it. See how I have select dependencies. You can exclude, you can unselect objects. So you have power to do this, but I like select dependency because it stops me from making mistakes. Excuse me. Okay. I'm now going to unselect everything because moving a bunch of stuff is going to take too much time, and I want this to be very quick. It's already telling me that there's dependencies. I am going to, and for the purposes of time, I'm just going to select a couple of TI processes and just move those over. There's no dependencies for these TI processes. I can see that I've selected 5 of them. One thing I almost forgot. Up at the top left, notice how it says load selections from file. If you're doing a complex migration and you're selecting many cubes, certain processes, you can save those selections so that the next time that you run it, you don't have to go through that tedium. You could just load the file and this screen will have those selections. So this is where you load it. In a few minutes, I will show you how to create the file. I'm going to click on next. Now here, this is totally optional. You can run processes over on the right. This is where you would enable them and specifically enable or disable the 4 different options. In V12, there is a marked difference between structure and data. They're treated differently. This wizard, where we are going to migrate database objects, is only concerned with the structure, the cubes, the elements, the parent-child relationships. The data does not come along. That is for security reasons. So what you can do, you can create a generic TI process that exports the data from the cubes of interest. That process will be triggered and run before pushing the repository. Then you push it to the repository, and then you can import and run the process after pulling the repository. So there will be a trigger on the destination that will tell that database to import that data. I am not going to do that now, so I'm just going to disable that and continue on my merry way. Let's click on next. Okay. Branches. Remember, branches in the Git role are kind of like subfolders. And those subfolders are on that main repository that we talked about. If I wanted to push something to a new branch, I would type in a branch name. I could type in IBM branch. It would be a sub branch off of usually main. That's the best practice. You have main, it is empty. I already have one that's called webinar. We're going to go to existing branch, but let me continue with the next few screens. So you would select the branch that it's based on. You would put in some type of message. This is where you would put the save selections as the file. And then you could upload it next time when you're at that select objects part. Okay. I'm going to do an existing branch. I've already shown you new branch. Let me do existing. So you click on existing. It's much simpler. Select the branch where this is the destination that the TM1 objects will go into Git. I've created one called webinar. Test is not that descriptive, so I will put webinar push. It's only 5 TI processes. I'm not going to bother saving it, so I'll keep it at none. And now notice how it's flipped. Add is now active. I'm going to press add, but a couple of things are going to happen, and they're going to happen pretty fast. There will be a TI process that's going to do all of the Git magic. If I could get to administration and activity, I could show it to you, but I'm usually not that fast. Two other things are going to happen. The icon for the server will change. I will point that out. And then we're going to look over here at the top right, and I want you to see the message that says that it has been successfully pushed. So I'm going to click on it. Notice how this icon now has that curved arrow. That means there's a Git push. If I go over to the right, objects from webinar source have been successfully added to the Git repository. So that is the first step. I got it from that container securely into Git. Now we're going to do the last step. I'm going to go to the destination and I'm going to import securely those objects from Git. So now I go over to webinar destination, 3 dots, remote repository operations. You guys already know. I'm always going to reset because I want to make sure everything is clean. So I'm going to reset. You don't have to, but you know, that's just how I work. I'm going to go to remote repository operations. Now, instead of adding objects, I'm going to update the model from the repository. This is what got cleared up. So just like we did before, this is the URL of the repository. Remember, this is kind of like that overarching main folder. I am going to copy over my public and my private key to create that secure tunnel. But now this is the tunnel that will go from the destination. I'm sorry, it goes from Git to the destination, not from the source, okay? I do my private key. We do not have any passphrases. I hit authenticate. Now we have the secure connection. Which branch do I want to update this from? I pushed it to webinar, but if you have multiple branches, you can select all of your branches. So I'm going to click on webinar. I'm going to click on update. And you would think it would update immediately, but there's one extra step. TM1 V12 will create a process plan or an update plan that shows you what is going to happen, what will be created. So this is a good point to review to make sure that you made all of the correct selections. I have made these correct selections. Now when you hit execute, you will see, excuse me, the curved arrow and updated model from repository successfully. I'm going to refresh the view and webinar destination, and there are my processes. So once you have set up your Git account, you get the private and public key, then you can start moving database objects between whatever servers that you want. As a summary, I would say you're going to do this a lot. So I would use that save selections and load selections from file to make this as less onerous as possible. And I believe I'm done, so I'm going to hand it back to you, Lee.
Great. Thanks, Ivan. So what have we talked about? In summary, simple statement, version 12 runs a little bit different behind the scenes. Okay? What does that mean? Very easy to set up, very easy to back up, very easy to maintain your servers. A lot more wizard-based approach, a lot more screen approaches, as opposed to knowing the intricacies of a Windows server or Linux coding or writing external codes. Okay. We also have the ability where logging is always on. It's no longer done on the server, but it's always on. We no longer have to make sure that the system's keeping record of everything. You no longer have to worry about auditing and tracking and aspects of that. Okay. Biggest thing that we saw is there's no access to the file system. Anything associated with Windows, anything associated with folder structure, aspects like that, you no longer have access to. Some of situations there's workarounds, some situations you'll use the interface, some aspects are no longer there. Okay. What does all this mean? It means that there's going to be some changes. Okay, I had said it before. It's different. Some you may say are good, some you may say are bad, some you may love, some you may hate. In the long run, it's different. And what this means with different, change management. This is your opportunity to rethink. How do you perform some of your tasks? For customers and clients who've always said, oh my gosh, there's so many better ways that we could do X, Y, Z, but I just never got around to it. This is a great opportunity to get around to it. Whether you're thinking of it as a user, a developer, an administrator, there are just different ways that you're going to have to do some pieces, but you could convert it into an opportunity of improving the ways that you want to do some of those pieces. Okay. And there's a lot more automation of your maintenance. What Ivan just showed us is the automated backup, how I can use that backup for migration. This is a way that we're going to look into aspects of saving, restoring, etc. And one of the things that we're going to play around with and look at as you continue to evolve in the system, there's some different approaches between how does the system look at data versus how does it look at the structures. So from a high level summary, there's some differences there. Okay. So based on that, now I'm going to turn things over to John, and he's going to help us wrap things up.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. So as you can see from the webinar, there have been a lot of changes associated with Planning Analytics version 12. Some of these changes are technical in nature. Some of them are process oriented, but this is really where Revelwood can help. Our combination of software knowledge and planning experience can help you with your implementation. Like we say on the slide, let us guide you through the forest. So we did a deep dive into some pretty technical details today. We know this can get really confusing very quickly, and this is another area we excel at. Whether you're looking to train your team on how to use the tool and the features, or whether you're looking for someone to review your existing model, we can help. We've got over 25 years of experience implementing solutions and helping you define, plan, and prep for what you need. Now, I just wanted to toss a quick slide on a solution we've developed to make your planning analytics life easier. And Data Maestro is a tool that we've developed to execute the movement of data within and across cubes faster and easier than ever before. Yeah, say you wanted to copy a scenario to a new quarter, maybe you want to increase the numbers 10%. Perhaps you've got multiple processes you run and would like to schedule them and also be notified that they ran and log them. How do you do that today? Probably using complex TI processes, if at all. With Data Maestro, you get all of that and more. All of the things you need to do, snapshotting, copying, manipulating data easily and quickly. Generally managing the movement of data in your PA environment without complex turbo integrator scripting. Happy to go over this in more depth when we follow up, but wanted to give you a quick insight as to that. And if you've got questions, I'll be happy to answer them at that time. So thanks for attending today's call. I hope the presentation gave you some information about the new version of PA. We'd appreciate you taking just 15 minutes of this over the next week or so for a quick chat. In the next day or so, we'll be reaching out to you to get your feedback. In the meantime, though, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me and with anything about the webinar or Data Maestro that you've seen here. Thanks for that. And any of the questions that were asked during the webinar, we'll follow up and reach out afterwards. So that concludes the webinar, and I appreciate your time today.